Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our fourth and final webinar in this series. My name is Erica Lundy, and I serve as the Southwest Iowa Extension Beef Specialist at Iowa State University. And on behalf of the Iowa Beef Center Extension team at Iowa State, we want to thank you for tuning in today and joining us during this series. So we hope that you found some valuable information throughout the series and can take it home and apply it before the breeding season. Our speaker today is Patrick Wall. He serves as our Southeast Iowa Extension Field Specialist. And Patrick is our go-to guy for all things related to genetics. So we've asked him to talk about capturing some of the benefits of heterosis. So in Extension, we learned that a lot of time our producers are aware of the benefits that crossbreeding can bring to that calf performance, but it's also kind of overlooked the advantage that having a crossbred cow brings to the table as well. So that's what Patrick is going to cover for us today.
Thanks, Erica. As she mentioned, not a lot new to talk about in terms of heterosis, but I think I'll approach this from a little different angle and maybe have you think about heterosis in a way you haven't thought about it before. Those of you that have heard me talk before know that I like to start out my presentations with a quote, and this one I think is pretty fitting for the topic that we're covering today, and that's match your cows to your environment and your bulls to your market. I honestly don't know who termed this quote. I believe I heard it at a Beef Improvement Federation meeting several years ago, and I've used it in talks for quite a while. But I also think that we need to look at heterosis as kind of like a three-legged stool. We certainly know that it is a breeding tool, but I also think we can harness it as an environmental tool, particularly when we're talking about maternal heterosis and matching those cows to your environment by using breeds that maybe do something really well that the other breed that you're after doesn't. And finally, it's a marketing tool. When you pick out your bull power, you can decide which bull best fits the market that you're headed for. What are the buyers in your area like to purchase? If they're willing to bid high on a certain type of calf, then try to use your bull power to make that happen. So I don't really want to get in the colors of the slide or things of that nature, but I just want to show you the pasture land acres in the U.S. and maybe why certain cow breeds work better in some areas than others. And I don't think since 07, you'll probably notice this slide's a bit dated. I don't think since 07 the pasture land acres have really changed a whole bunch. But when we look at delivered feed, so this is haylage, grass silage, green chop from a poll a few years later, 2012. Yeah, you'll notice, I'll flip back and forth between these two. You'll notice a dramatic impact in certain areas of the country, particularly East Texas, Arkansas, Southern Missouri, where the land isn't necessarily good enough to raise seed crops, but it certainly raises some really good hay, really good silage, haylage, if you will. So we deliver more feed to those cows, and I think once we mirror where cows and calf, or when we look at the cows and calf concentration on the next slide, I put this kind of imaginary line up here to talk about environmental impact. You'll see that in areas where there is more delivered feed south of this line, the cows are certainly different. They have to endure a much harsher environment. You'll see more eared cattle or more zebu influence, more Brahman influence south of that line, certainly than you would north. So basically what I'm trying to get at is your location and where you source your genetics will vary across the country. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of heterosis. If you look at cattle and calves, like I just mentioned, you'll see the concentration of delivered feed is where there's a lot of cows. And if you look west of there, you'll notice those dark counties are certainly West Texas, Western Kansas, up through Nebraska and into Northeast Iowa, heavy feedlot concentration, and then of course, Wisconsin with a lot of dairy cattle. But depending on your location will drastically alter what heterosis plan or what crossbreeding plan works for you. I won't bore you with a lot of history, but I do think it's important that we kind of go back and see what has been done and how long it's been looked at and what we learned. And first I could find the research of the benefits of crossbreeding was back in the late 50s. It was a multi-year study out of Nebraska in conjunction with the Meat Animal Research Center, but certainly not the Meat Animal Research Center as we know it today, but in conjunction with that group. The next thing is maybe something a lot of you didn't think about, but if you grew up in the seed stock world, this was a big day. In 1969, a steer by the name of Conoco won the International in Chicago, and he was the first crossbred steer to do so. He was a Charolais Angus, and one of the most significant things was the steer graded low choice and was a yield grade 2. And at that time, that was a very desirable carcass and still would be today. So it really changed the way a lot of producers thought about their beef. Really important to understand that, we've been mating to Bos Indicus or eared cattle for a long, long time. The Brangus started clear back in the early 30s, even though the American Brangus Breeders Association wasn't incorporated until 1949. So we've been using eared cattle for a long, long time. If we fast forward to today, we're in kind of a new world because we've got breed associations cooperating together. The Premium Red Baldy program is actually an F1 cooperation between Red Angus and Hereford. Those associations have joined teams to try to generate an F1 female to use in the commercial sector. And IGS is International Genetic Solutions, which is basically the genetic arm of the Simmental Association. And today we're producing EPDs and genetic indicators for hybrid cattle that show up in multiple breed registries. So we're certainly in a much different place today as far as the tools you have at your disposal than we were, say, 50, 60 years ago. I use this slide a lot when I talk about crossbreeding. I've been in touch with the folks at MARC. I will be updating this slide in the coming months. I'm just waiting on some new mature cow weights. And there will be some re-ranking, but the drive of this slide is these aren't your grandpa's breed. If you notice who's at the top, these are ranked in terms of cow weight, basically cow weight. But you've got Hereford Angus and Red Angus over on the left up at the top. And those are the largest breeds, and these are 4-year-old purebred cows at the USDA Research Center. So throughout history, if you ask somebody about the stereotype of the Continentals versus the British breeds would have been used to moderate a herd, and Simmental, Gelbvieh, Limousin, Charolais were predominantly adding growth and performance. Well, today, the Simmental or the Continental breeds have worked really hard on moderating their mature size and getting a little more softer of maternal look versus Hereford Angus and Red Angus, who really worked hard on performance. And as you can tell, both groups were very successful in what they did. The other drive of this slide is to look top to bottom and see how similar the breeds really are versus where they were 50 years ago. There's not a ton of variation within the breeds we have at our disposal. So very important when you talk about going out to use a breed in a crossbreeding program, that you're not using old assumptions. If I polled an audience, which I've done this in the past, and I asked them, which breed would you use to moderate mature cow size, Hereford would still be a very popular answer. And I think it's important to understand that that breed is in a far different place than it was, and so are all the others. So maybe a reevaluation of kind of what you assume a breed to be before you go and utilize them in a crossbreed. I grew up with Angus cattle, so this ad campaign is certainly not new to me. I'm not going to tell you that I remember it, when it came out or what issue it was in. I do not. But it is ironic, and we have to keep in mind that we have done intense selection pressure on performance, and the breeds that were quote unquote too big years ago are more moderate, and the breeds that were more moderate 50 years ago are certainly bigger. I think it's important to remind ourselves that there's as much variation within a breed as there is between breeds. And I just did some internet search and I found these two photos, and not stereotypical of the breed that they talk about. So there's a Hereford bull that's really big and harsh in his kind, not certainly what you would think of when you think about Herefords. And the bull on the upper left is actually a Limousin, very soft and maternal in his look, not a typical Limousin bull. If you just look at what the breeds were, either in the case of Limousin when they came over to the U.S., in the case of Hereford, what a stereotypical Hereford looks like clear back in the belt buckle days. As we all that being said, our cows are bigger. This is an historical look of annual carcass weights, and they've gone up. And this ends in 2014. I looked really hard for something more recent, couldn't find it, but I think we all know that in the last 5 to 6 years that carcass weights have certainly not gotten smaller, and I don't believe our cows have gotten any smaller either. So does this change your marketing plan? And I think maybe you have to just think about what's out there in terms of the genetics you can get after. And if you're wanting to significantly moderate your cow size, it's going to be more difficult to find those genetics than maybe it was 20 years ago. So this slide was created years ago from the folks at Meat Animal Research Center. We call it the spider web. And it is basically an estimation of the DNA that all of the breeds that we're used to have in common. And if you look at the center of this spider web, that kind of represents the first domesticated beef animal. You'll notice BR, that's Brahman down here. They come from a different genus and species, so they're a different beast altogether, if you will. But you think about Angus. Angus and Red Angus were combined at one time. So if you cross those two breeds, your heterosis advantage is very small. You've got manes and shorthorns over here that were combined at one time as well. So these are typical British cattle. Notice that Hereford is clear on the other side of the spider web, quite a bit unrelated to really any other thing on the page. You'll also notice that a shorthorn female that's pictured here, she could pass for a Red Angus, and people wouldn't really argue with you. So you can make breeds look very similar just based on selection. The Hereford bull that you got in the upper right, the HL actually represents the line 1 herd out in Montana that was isolated for it's better than 50 years now. They can actually isolate that DNA from the rest of the Hereford population. And we'll talk about how that's utilized in the Hereford breed as we move forward as kind of an in-herd or in-breed heterosis. You'll also notice that the continental breeds are together. They were developed basically in the same part of Europe, but they also sit closer to Black Angus because most of those breeds have turned themselves into a black-hided animal predominantly. So they certainly do share more DNA with the Angus breeds than some of the others. And then you've got Brangus, Beefmaster, and Santa Gertrudis over here, Charlet, Lemmy, and then the Brahman bull over on the far right. Those crosses between Shorthorn and Hereford, obviously Santa Gertrudis sits right in between those two breeds as being a part of that cross. I do think it's important to point out that the distance from the Black and Red Angus breed to, say, Hereford is very far. It is no accident why that cross is one of the most popular F1s in the country. The heterosis advantage between those two breeds is very well known, and it's been very well known for a long time. So just a real simple depiction of what heterosis is. Take two breeds that are maybe very dissimilar in what they bring to the table. What you would expect is certainly the average of what the two parents can generate. Heterosis is what you actually get as a result of that. So it exceeds what either parent could do on its own in a purebred system. And the distance of these graphs is certainly not the same relative to the trait. Whether you're talking about pounds of performance or fertility in bred females, all of those things, the distance between these bar charts is not always the same depending on the breed or depending on the trait. It varies trait to trait, varies breed to breed. So why do we cross breeds? Well, pretty simple, breed complementarity. The more unrelated the breeds, the better. We talked about that on the previous slide, and I'll use my quote again. We should cross breeds to match our cows to their environment and the bulls to the market those calves are going to go into. So I'm going to use a really drastic example to sort of drive home the point of how heterosis can work in traits that we don't typically measure. These two wonderful specimens here are what we call Afrikanders. They are a breed that was developed in South Africa. Obviously, they're used to some pretty harsh climate, pretty hot conditions, lots of bugs, things of that nature. And actually an Iowa producer by the name of Steve Rudakovich grabbed some semen from an Afrikander and used it on his Hereford cows in the upper Midwest, and found out that he treated no F1s for pink eye or had any issues with cancer eye. This breed absolutely eliminated the risk of that from the Hereford population. And I think it's important, if you guys can see my cursor, to notice the eye on this bull. He is looking sort of directly into the sun, but you can't see his eyeball. He has a hood over his eye, and if you look over here at the cow, she does as well. That doesn't happen by accident. If you get shading over the top of the eyeball, the sun can't get to the eye nearly as easily. And then also, as these animals have their head down grazing, they're a lot less likely to catch their eye on a thorny bush or a stick or a twig. The eyeball, which we know can cause issues with pink eye and cancer eye. So selection pressure placed on traits that we don't normally think about can actually be utilized in a heterosis plant. We often talk about heterosis as being one bucket of information, or one thing that we gather. Well, actually, there's three types. Individual heterosis is the most obvious one. It is what we find in this F1 calf here on the far right. He's the mix between a Hereford bull and an Angus cow, and that's what we call individual heterosis. Probably the more valuable term would be maternal heterosis. It is 2/3 of the crossbreeding advantage, and if this calf here on the right is in fact a heifer, then we can talk about her maternal advantage in the next generation. We'll do that here in the next slide. One we don't often think about is paternal heterosis. We often call them composite bulls, whether Sim Angus or Limflex or Balancers or whatever we term them. That is actually paternal heterosis, and we'll cover that here in a second. So maternal heterosis is obviously the most important. And the reason for that is it affects reproductive performance. We get those cows in heat earlier, they conceive earlier, lower embryonic death loss, faster breed back. They wean a higher percentage of the calves, and they simply last in the herd longer. 1.3 years in a commercial herd is a long time across a whole bunch of cows. There is a maternal impact on calf performance. We'll cover that in the next slide. And more milk and improved immune response. I want to spend a little bit more time on this lower embryonic death loss. If we think about the Holstein breed, they are largely a line-bred population for a number of generations. And they've actually found several, I believe it's up to a dozen or better, haplotypes in the Holstein population that cause embryonic death. They a bull and a cow that carry this haplotype that the embryo will not survive through parturition. And most of the time, those cows come back in heat fairly early after the conception of the first embryo. I think the more research goes on, the more unrelated the breeds actually dramatically decreases the chances that we have embryonic death. You think about the spider web, this cow here on the right. The chances of this cow, the chances of the Angus cow or bull and the Hereford cow or bull carrying the same embryonic death gene are very low because they don't share any DNA, versus two black-hided breeds, which the chances are much higher. So I think some of our increases in profitability happen from the sheer fact that the breeds are unrelated. So I talked about paternal heterosis, increased mating ability, fertility, longevity. Lower culling rates, increased scrotal circumference, and sperm viability. I mean, all said, the bulls just last longer, stick around longer, and that, from a profitability standpoint, is really, really helpful to a commercial producer if they don't go have to buy an entire new bull battery every year, every other year. We talked about the individual heterosis of that calf, higher early calf growth, and certainly more vigor, more live calves, and endure harsher environments as well. So that's where the profitability lies in the crossbreed. We can estimate heterosis per trait, and if we look at a summary of a whole bunch of heterosis analysis, we can come up with an estimate, and there's certainly variations within this, but 8% on calf crop weaned, 13% in weaning weight, a little bit less in yearling, and then 3% for carcass traits. I think a lot of the opponents to crossbreeding would use this number here to their advantage. You'll notice that the higher the heritability of the trait, the less kick of heterosis there is as a general rule. And then the more environmental impact, or the harder the trait is to measure, like the fertility traits and longevity traits, the heterosis kick is much higher. So lifetime productivity, 25%. That's obviously based a lot on fertility of the female, and then how long she stays in the herd. So these are several examples, they're probably not all of them, but of the crossbreeding systems that we utilize in the beef industry. And the most difficult one on the page is 100% maximum heterosis, and that is a terminal sire on a purchased F1 female. And the reason I say purchased is if you retain your own heifers, this crossbreeding system simply can't happen. But 23 to 28% in percent increase in calf weight per cow exposed. So that's twofold. You get more cows bred, you get more cows bred early, calves are larger, and that results in that increase in not only number of calves, but the calves are bigger. So an example of this would be a Hereford Angus female on, say, a Charolais bull. If you take that one step further, maybe it's a Red Angus Hereford female on a Sim Angus bull. The bull breed needs to be a different breed than the two that are in the female breed. So this is what we would call maximum heterosis purebreds. So my family is involved in the Hereford business now. I used to work for the Shorthorn Association, and there were a lot of old-time Shorthorn breeders that would tell me that you never should be more than 3 generations from a horned bull. And I remembered that statement. And now that I'm in the Hereford breed, there are a lot of purebred breeders that about every 3 generations will go grab a line 1 horned Hereford and put those genetics in their herd, because it is sort of whether the math shows up or not, an attempt of outcrossing or capturing some within breed heterosis. Just the more popular ones, because they're easier to do long term, would be the 2 breed composite or the 3 breed composite. There's still considerable heterosis there, and certainly easier to manage that as we move forward. I only think it's fair that we cover the disadvantages of crossbreeding too, because it's not all roses, as we say. There are some drawbacks, and one of them is certainly at the max level. It's just simply not sustainable, particularly if you retain your own heifers, which the vast majority of commercial producers want to retain their own heifers. If you try to achieve maximum heterosis, it may require some annual off-farm purchase. Whether you're buying off-farm bred heifers, bred cows, pairs, whatever it might be, there's an added health risk there. If you're buying pairs, you're bringing a new bug load home with that calf crop. If you're buying breds, there's new strains of potential for pink eye, things like that. So there's an added health risk with trying to capture some of this. Things that a producer would tell you if they don't crossbreed is they don't like the inconsistency of the calf crop, and that is a drawback. particularly when you start talking about inconsistencies in hide color, horn polled status, or basically anything that would cause the sale barn or the auction barn or the online sort put those cattle in several groups. The smaller the group size, the less premium they demand. So there is a drawback from an inconsistency standpoint. And in reality, this is the opposite of line breeding. We are creating an inconsistent calf crop just based on the fact that we're using more lines of genetics from multiple different breeds. I think one of the disadvantages that might go unnoticed or at least underreported is the relationship a commercial producer might have with their genetic supplier. They understand where they live, what their needs are. They're happy with the genetics their supplier has been sending them, and there is real value in that. You can't really fault a commercial producer for being in a situation that they like and producing cattle that they're happy with. So we'll go through a little bit of math on the dollars of what you can get by utilizing heterosis. And we're going to use an example of a 100-cow herd with an 80% weaning rate, very typical of a commercial herd in the upper Midwest, just under 600 pounds for a weaning weight. And this is over a 10-year horizon, so long-term dedication to a crossbreeding system. If you use the 4% estimation for calf survival to weaning, over 10 years, you will sell 40 more calves, very significant number. And if you look at the advantage in weaning weight from planned crossbreeding, it's about 8%. That's almost 37,000 pounds of calf that will be sold. And then if you use the weaning weight per cow exposed, I'm going to use the bottom end of the window that we showed you a couple of slides ago, 23 to 28%. And over 10 years, if you can add weaning weight per cow exposed and include the 23% figure, that's 105,000 pounds of calf. I used $1.50. I know we're not there today, but on average, I think we can probably achieve that fairly easy for a 5-weight calf. You calculate that out, and that's $158 per cow per year just by using a planned crossbreeding mating. So certainly nothing to shake a stick at. That is real dollars, real money over a long period of time. Special thanks to my quarantine crew. Not that I'm counting, but this is day 39 of me being home with my kids every day. So certainly challenging to put presentations and webinars together, but it's been different, but it's been fun for the most part. And those are my two kids showing at the Iowa State Fair, and I am incredibly hopeful that we will be there again in a couple of months. But, we'll get through this. The beef industry will come out on the other side of this, hopefully better than we went in, but certainly challenging times that we're in. To my team, you've seen this slide before if you've been on. Good group, like working with them, and our phone numbers and emails are there and readily available on the internet if you want to come ask us questions, particularly if you're having a crossbreeding plan or have questions in that area. And with that, I will take any questions you folks may have. Erica, I'm assuming these will show up in my chat box somehow or another.
Yeah, so participants, if you have questions, again, we have the little chat box icon down towards the bottom. You can click on that and enter your questions there, or you can also go through the 3 dots that are at the bottom as well, and they'll pop up a Q&A box where you can ask those questions there. So Patrick, some might come to you directly, and they may also come to Beth or I as well. Those benefits captured in EPDs.
Okay, good question. So the heterosis estimates that I actually posted, the USDA Meat Animal Research Center has estimated within trait heterosis estimates breed to breed across the breeds that they have. So basically, if the weaning weight advantage between a Simmental and an Angus cross is 8%, that value is backed out of the estimate before they go into a genetic evaluation. So they take the estimate of heterosis on a trait between the breeds, and they back it out of the actual performance before they calculate the EPD. So that's a long, windy way of saying that they try to eliminate heterosis from a crossbreed EPD estimation. Good question.
Got another question in. Does a three-way cross lose or gain some of the advantages of heterosis? For example, if your cow is a Hereford Angus cross and you breed to a Charolais, is the heterosis benefit decreased by this?
No, actually, that example is what we would call maximum heterosis. So the more unrelated the breeds, the better. So if you use breeds that are close together on that spider web, let's say you have a red Angus female, her heterosis level is certainly decreased versus the Hereford Angus. So it's all relative to how different the breeds are. But an F1 female using a different breed of bull is what we would call maximum heterosis. But that being said, the more unrelated the breeds, the better the advantage in what we call heterosis kick, if you will. To take that a step further, that three-way cross, if it was a female and you kept the three-way cross cow in your herd, eventually you will look at a depressed level of heterosis because you'll have to go back to a breed that's already in the pedigree of that cow. So it gets more difficult to maintain maximum heterosis because you run out of unrelated breeds.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions coming in. If you do have those, feel free to go ahead and enter them for us yet. But in conclusion here, just want to thank you for joining us today. And if you've been on some of the other webinars in this series too, thank you for that. So our goal with this series was to hopefully provide you with some different pieces of information that you can take home and apply to your breeding season and your cow herd yet this year, and be able to see some of the benefits and get more of those females bred earlier. So if you have additional questions regarding planning your breeding season or just other beef questions in general, please do feel free to reach out to us or any of the extension specialists at Iowa State, and we'll be happy to help you out. So thank you for joining us and hope to see you out in the field soon.